So without further ado, let me welcome Tracey Gendron.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure that works. Okay, so welcome everyone. As Jeff says, my name is Tracey Gendron. I am coming to you from Richmond, Virginia today, where it is a super miserable, rainy, cold day, and the perfect time to sit and have this conversation with you. Ageism Unmasked is the name of the book that I wrote that was published a couple months ago. But ageism is something that I have been thinking about for many, many years. I have been researching for many years, and I became really passionate about when I had my first aha moment of realizing that ageism is everywhere and completely invisible all at the same time. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I have learned, what I'm passionate about, and I welcome all of your questions. I really think that this is a conversation that is best had with dialogue. It's best had when we can engage with each other, when we can, ask questions of ourselves and each other. So please feel free to use the Q&A. Please feel free to use the chat. I would just love to hear your thoughts and see your thoughts as we have this discussion. So I'm going to start by posing the really big question, which is, what is ageism? And that question is actually much more complicated than I think a lot of people realize, because ageism is everywhere and it is in everything. And as I said before, it's so ubiquitous that it's so normalized that it is practically invisible, and it's kind of hard for us to see all the ways that it manifests. When we think about ageism, we usually think about it in terms of discriminating against people at work. That's the first thing that I find that comes to mind for people that are not really familiar with the depth of ageism. And that is one way that ageism manifests. We definitely see people who have difficulty either finding a job or being promoted at a job, or younger people that are discriminated against because they are deemed too young to have the knowledge or the experience, whether they do or not. So ageism at work is one way that it manifests. And that really speaks to the othering aspect of ageism. So ageism is basically, at its core, discrimination based on age. So it is when we view somebody that is differently aged from us as an other, and we make assumptions and we label them, and that leads to prejudice, that can lead to stereotyping, that can lead to discrimination. That's called externalized ageism. But there's a whole other form of ageism that's internalized ageism. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because internalized ageism is about how you feel about yourself as an aging person. When I do talks, I will very often ask the audience the first question to say, who in this audience is not aging? Raise your hand if you're not aging. And of course, people look at me and they smile and chuckle a little bit. But the point of it is that there's no such thing as someone that is not aging, which means that ageism is about all of us. It is relevant to all of us. It is about either the fear or the excitement that you carry with you about what it means to be of the age you are now and what it means to be all of the ages that you will become. So that internalized ageism actually is quite profound. So let's start there. Let's start by really thinking about it on a personal level. What do you think it means to be old? How do you feel about yourself as an aging person? Do you think of yourself as someone that is aging? Or have you done what so many other people do and you kind of other or disassociate yourself from someone that's aging? And then how do you talk about growing older? Do you even think about it in terms of growing older, or is it more passive, as in becoming older? So just take a moment and think about these questions. Maybe even jot down an answer or two, or at least just kind of have it in your mind, because I'm going to ask you to rethink about these in a little while after we have a conversation. So when we start thinking about ageism, I think we first need to think about the broader context of who we are. And that means all of the different aspects of our identity, because that's what shapes our world experiences. It's about our sexuality, our race, our education, our ethnicity, our gender. All of these things come together to create how the world experiences us and how we experience the world. Age can be unique, as can ability, in that it consistently changes over time. So who we are at 10 versus who we are at 30 versus who we are at 60, it evolves, it changes. We respond to the world differently, and the world responds to us differently when we're those ages. So age is one of those things that you're kind of constantly forming and reforming. But it does come together with all of these other aspects of your identity to create your unique experience with the world, right? So everybody's going to have their own relationship to their age identity. For ability identity, that can change at any point during our life. But certainly as we get older and we do experience physical changes. So when we think about ageism and we think about our age identity, it's good to think about it in this larger context. Speaking of ability, ageism and ableism are really interconnected. And I think it's important that we recognize that from the very beginning of a conversation about ageism. Ageism, as I talked about, is broadly discrimination based on age. Ableism is discrimination based on ability, perceived level of ability or inability. And as you know, we very much live in a world, in a society, in a culture that is built for people that are abled, right? It becomes harder and harder to navigate the world when we have either a visible or an invisible disability. I even can just think about what it's like to dine in a restaurant sometimes, being somebody now that has presbyopia, that can't see as well up close. When you're in a restaurant that's very dimly lit, where the menu is in a fancy font and it's really tiny, and there's not enough light to see, and there may be ambient noise in the background, that's kind of the culmination of ageism and ableism. That environment is not built to support people that may have different sensory abilities or capacities. So these two things often go hand in hand because aging includes biological change. So even though we can have a disability at any point in our life, we are more likely to have physical losses as we grow older. At the same time, we're also having incredible growth, which is also part of the aging experience. Psychosocial growth. Aging is not just about our physical bodies and our changes that we experience. But in that way, ageism and ableism go hand in hand. So when we think about the internalized ageism, it's really powerful because there's a ton of data out there that shows that how we feel about ourselves as aging people have really serious consequences. This is really in large part a representation of Dr. Becca Levy's work. She has a book out now, Breaking the Age Code, that I would also recommend in addition to my book. I think together they really tell the story of why this matters to our health. Her research has really pinpointed that how we feel about our own aging, that either joy or that stress that we carry around, kind of dreading getting older, can lead us to increased risk for chronic diseases, can mean that we have the more likely have biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease or other dementia disorders, can take us longer to recover. And what's ironic about that is that we actually end up manifesting the very things that we fear. Right? We fear as we're going to get older that we may experience cognitive decline. We fear that we may experience some memory loss. Well, the stress and the dread that we carry around with that fear actually makes us more likely to manifest that. And then we miss out on all of the opportunities that aging can bring. And if that's not enough to think of ageism as a public health crisis, there's about 25 years of data that shows that people who have positive views of their own aging, are you ready for this? They live on average 7.5 years longer than people that have negative views of their own aging. That's some really powerful research. And to me, that statistic alone really shows that ageism is a public health crisis. And it is up there with social isolation. And it is up there with the risk of smoking and the risk of poor nutrition. How we feel about ourselves, about as an aging person, really does have a profound impact. And to me, that's what makes ageism truly a public health concern. My own research has really looked at the relationship between ageism and business or the economy. So I was really interested in people that work with older people and how they felt about their own aging and whether that impacted how happy they were in their jobs and how likely they were to stay in their jobs. And what I found is that there's a retention and a recruitment issue that has ageism at the core. It's interesting when you think about hiring people to work in aging fields, to work with older adults. How often do we ask the question, do you like being around older people? Not too often. And yet I found there's a whole lot of people working with older people that don't seem to really enjoy working with older people. How often do we really ask the question, how do you feel about your own aging? Do you have anxiety about it? Do you give in to some of the myths and stereotypes about aging? That's also another clue, because people in my study that had higher levels of aging anxiety weren't likely to stay in their jobs. They weren't likely to be happy in their jobs. Well, we know that not only translates to a bottom line issue in terms of, the bottom line of economics, but it also means that people are receiving substandard care, because when we're not happy in our jobs, we're not doing the best job possible. So ageism affects our health. Ageism affects our longevity. Ageism is bad for business. And as I started with, if it's not enough for you, ageism does remain a significant problem within the workforce. It keeps people from contributing to the workforce. It keeps people from growing. And that's people of all ages. Ageism at work really does cost money. It keeps older people out of jobs, and that takes away their ability to contribute economically. And the funny thing about that is that we're in the midst of this longevity revolution. We are living longer than we ever have before. There are many people of all ages, but especially older people, that want to keep working. They want to keep working because it is a source of purpose, because it is something that they enjoy. It could be the same career they've been in, it could be a new career, but to automatically assume that older people don't want to work, I think is a mistake on many levels. On top of that, many people need to keep working, so we should never make the assumption that retirement is for everybody. So there's an economic issue. But aside from that, I think there's really a lack of innovation because of this. Businesses really miss out on the opportunity to look differently at products and services for older people. I think businesses often get locked into thinking about products and services they think older people want, which tend to focus around the need for security, the need for safety, the need for surveillance. I can think about, security life alerts. I can think about all of the advertisements you see for medications and for back braces and all of that. And all of that is important. But what about innovation focusing on the need for purpose, the need for self-actualization, the need for belonging, the need for contributing? There's less of those, and yet there's all kinds of opportunities that I can see. The other scary part about this is that we often will, say that we know what older people want without asking older people themselves. And we don't include them. We don't include them in the research and development. We don't include them in the algorithms that we create with our big data that give us suggestions. So there's really missed opportunities there, not only to ask older people, but to have them engaged in the entire process. And that's a form of ageism as well. Within healthcare, ageism has an annual cost of $63 billion. And ageism in healthcare, it can be very problematic. When we experience othering in a healthcare setting, it can keep us from seeking care. If you go to a doctor, you go to any health professional that dismisses your pain or dismisses your symptoms because they simply say, you're just old. That should be expected as you get old. Not only could they be missing something that's really treatable, but that sends a message to the person seeking care that maybe they're not that important, that maybe they're not that valuable, that maybe they've been dismissed just because they are older. And meanwhile, then there's also the risk of misdiagnosing something that could easily be treated. When we walk around with ideas and myths like depression is a normal part of aging, it's not. Like cognitive decline is a normal part of aging, it's not. Then we miss these opportunities to treat people and to contribute to their well-being, to contribute to their growth. So ageism in healthcare is also a profound impact. So I like to bring up this ageism in the era of COVID because for me, this was one of the reasons that I decided to write the book when I did. You know, I'm sure you all know you write a book mentally for years. It takes a really long time to fully understand, you know, the issue that you're working with, the issue that you're thinking about. And sometimes that mental work has this moment where it's like, this is it, this is the catalyst. Well, COVID was one of the catalysts for me. At the very beginning of March 2020, when we really started to see a rise in ageist rhetoric, it really started to shine a light on how deeply embedded ageism is. And at that moment in time, I think there was an opportunity because we started to see more and more conversations, articles, people talking about ageism. And I saw it play out in the personal space, in the political space, and in the structural space. So personally, I think we all remember the sentiments early on that COVID was a disease that only affected older people, that we shouldn't really have to care so much about it because, you know, older people should just kind of be the ones to quarantine to keep themselves safe. An example of how we don't see successful aging as a community endeavor, that we put it on the individual, where it's really the structure in the whole community. Politically, we started to see politicians come out and say, hey, we can't close the economy. So again, I think the economy is more important than older people. Let's just quarantine them. Let's get the younger people back to work. And this was something that was just out there in the open that people could easily say, not recognizing the deep embedded ageism within that. And then structurally, I found it really fascinating and quite troubling that the care communities, long-term care communities, were really struggling to get the protection that they needed. And yet the most deaths, the biggest outbreaks were in long-term care. And it brought up questions of structural ageism to me in not just how we devalue older people, but how we don't prioritize the people that work to support older people. And this led to some conversations about living wage. And I'm glad to see that we are having more of those conversations about fairly compensating people, but it's a bigger issue than that. I think it really goes to the overall culture and how we value the people that are working every day in long-term care, in congregate living settings to support older people. And that we need kind of a culture shift there as well. So these were some of the things that said, I want to understand how we got here, which is why I wrote that book. So one of the other things that I learned, and this was not only during COVID, but this has really been since, is that the way that we view generations, I believe, contributes to ageism, and I call it generational ageism. So a generation is a social group. So it's basically something that we constructed, right? That says there are all of these social groups of people that were born in a 15+ year of time, a span of time. And because they were born within this span of time, that means that they have experienced some of the same historical events, and therefore they must have a distinct consciousness. Therefore, we must be able to predict their likes and their dislikes and their values. And we've really, really leaned into this concept of a generation. So we talk really readily now about 4 or 5 generations: the silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials or Gen Y, Gen Z, and now I'm starting to hear Gen Alpha is the next. And my feeling is that not only are these generations completely arbitrary, completely made up, but they are very damaging. And they are damaging because they lead us right into this slippery slope of labeling, of categorizing, and of stereotyping people. If I hear one more thing about millennials ruining something, whether they are millennials or not, we use that as a catchphrase now for younger people, or baby boomers being responsible for something, it's extraordinarily frustrating. And it's frustrating because when we give into those, we are not seeing the unique person in front of us. Besides the fact, again, it makes no sense. So let me explain it this way. You have baby boomers who were born supposedly from 1946 to 1964. That's a really big span, almost 20 years. And that means that a baby boomer who was born in 1946 was actually in their teens and 20s, their really formative years, in the 1960s. The 1960s was a very, very distinct period of time. This was the hippie movement. This was the Vietnam War. This was assassinations and political unrest. And there was a lot that was going on at that time that had to shape those persons' experiences. And of course, then it also goes back to all the forms of their identity and who they were and who they've become. So that's one baby boomer. Now think about a second one born in 1964. They were in their teens and 20s in the formative years in the 1980s. The 1980s was a completely different period of time. Cold War, different kind of politics, different kind of technology that was happening, and yet we call them both baby boomers. And we make these assumptions that therefore they believe the same things, they have the same values, they have the same experiences. It just doesn't make sense. So I think it's time for us to rethink these generational labels and think of them in terms of ageism. And how it creates this cycle of ageism. And this is what I call the cycle of generational ageism, or just the cycle of relational ageism. To me, this kind of explains how contagious ageism is. So when we express ageism, when we express preference for either differently aged peoples or to look younger or be younger or feel younger, we are actually then putting that out into the world and putting that on to somebody else. Very often the danger of that is that it comes across as a quote compliment to someone. And then they take that in as, oh, wow, okay, they're telling me I look young. They're telling me I'm acting young. That's good. I must feel really good about that. And then they internalize that message and it leads right to those negative health outcomes we talked about. It's a cycle and it goes around and around. This also happens when we generalize based on generations. If we are constantly criticizing those millennials or people that are younger, we're not only feeding their ageism of the older people, we're feeding internalized ageism as well. It's like this very dysfunctional merry-go-round that we kind of keep getting on and are having trouble getting off. So I think we need to see these cultural messages that come at us, and we need to kind of unmask, right? We need to take the blinders off so that we can see it first and then decide whether we feel like it's valid or not. So I think it's always helpful to kind of walk through some examples. Again, ageism is everywhere, and I think it can be informative to kind of give you a couple of examples of how this manifests in our personal space, in our social space, in institutions, and in cultures. So I'm going to give you some of the language of internalized ageism to start. So internalized ageism is how we talk about ourselves as aging people. And here's a couple of examples. If someone says, I'm not old, I'm just more mature. Or if someone says, there's still so much to learn, even at my age. Well, let's start with, I'm not old, I'm just more mature. The problem with that statement is that we are still stigmatizing what it means to be old. Why are we not old? What's wrong with being old? It comes back to that first question that I asked you about what do you think of the word old? What does it mean? Old could mean all kinds of things. In its most basic sense, old just really means something that is longer lived. It's not good or bad, it just is. It's a state of being. When we cover that up with words like mature or vintage or seasoned or experience, what we're really doing is still putting a Band-Aid on the fact that we don't want to identify as old, which then still stigmatizes what it means to be old. With the comment, there's still so much to learn even at my age. There's two tiny little words in there, but I think those words actually have a really big impact. Still and even. Of course, there's still so much to learn, but when we qualify it in terms of still and even, we're kind of suggesting that that's surprising. We're kind of suggesting that that might be out of the norm. So language matters. It matters because of that relational cycle that I talked about. When we talk about it, we are then role modeling it for other people. Age shaming is another way that we will see it manifest in the personal space. Either towards younger people, you're too young to know what I'm talking about. which I have heard many times, or my partner will be upset because I revealed that they're however old, 65 years old. I actually like using that particular example. My partner will be upset because that came directly from the White House Conference on Aging in 2015. And it shows that we still, even though that was many years ago, have a long way to go recognizing this, even in my own backyard, even in my own discipline. We still are kind of covering up this shame with how old we are, instead of kind of just acknowledging, I am 51 years old. There's nothing good, there's nothing bad. I am just 51 years old, and letting the shame go and being able to just acknowledge that. So age shaming is another way that this infects our language. In the social space, this also gets to that relational piece of how we give it back and forth to each other. So take this example of, oh, you don't look old, or you haven't aged a bit. When we say that to somebody, again, their primary reaction is, thank you. That's such a compliment. That feels so good to hear. Might seem innocuous, but underneath that, we are really perpetuating, we don't want to look old. We don't want to look aged. We don't want to act old or be aged. And that's a very important message that flows through, seemingly unrecognized. That's within the social space of how we give it back and forth to each other. I have a colleague here, and if she hears one more time, are you a student? You don't look old enough to be a professional, even though she is a professor, gets her extraordinarily frustrated, because again, she feels as if there's a judgment being placed on her because of the way that she looks. This is how it travels within this social space. Within the institutional space, there's a lot of policies and procedures, both things that are within the culture of institutions and things that are really explicit that can contribute to ageism. Age discrimination policies, retirement policies, even Medicare, because it is age-based, can be perceived that way. These are a couple of the ways that I think it more insidiously infects our culture. Very often in workforce cultures, I'm curious to find out how birthdays and anniversaries are celebrated. I myself have witnessed those, quote, over the hill balloon birthday themed parties at work, or cards that, say, I can't believe you've been here this long. You're a dinosaur. Happy birthday, happy anniversary. Again, might seem funny, but the messages behind it are not. The messages behind that are oppressive. And then also when we look at a lack of age diverse teams, there's a lot of research that shows us that people in age diverse teams actually have higher productivity, and they really do organically develop relationships based on affinity, based on skills. Age is not an affinity. So we need to really be thinking of how we can bring differently aged people together, people that are different in all forms of identities, to create really strong functional teams and to learn from each other. Sometimes that has to be done really purposely, though, if the culture does not support it. So that's sometimes how we see it in institutions. And then within the culture, we have these kind of really big catastrophic kind of language that we see, the crisis language of the aging population. That can go with the silver tsunami that we often hear about, of older people that are going to wash over us and, destroy the economy and our healthcare system. This catastrophic language obviously is meant to elicit some sort of stress. But what it does is really takes things out of proportion, doesn't frame things in an appropriate or productive way. So that crisis language is really problematic. Just the fact that we have a thriving anti-aging industry is really indicative of where we are as a culture. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry that profits off of shame, that profits off of telling people what they should look like, how they should feel, how they should act, that they should take supplements and products and dye hair, whatever it may be, in order to maintain this standard of success that they have defined. That's really powerful advertising. And if you think about it, we wouldn't tolerate it if we had an anti-gender industry, or an anti-race industry. If you put some kind of other demographic or identity characteristic there, we would recognize that was really offensive. But with aging, we have yet to do so. And then, as I said before, it goes to the whole millennials ruin everything. That is just as much of as a catastrophic kind of languaging problem as this crisis languaging is. When we blame an entire group of people for ills or woes, we miss all of the amazing people that are within that cohort that are doing wonderful things. So these are some of the ways that we see it manifesting at all different levels. I think it's also really important to recognize how ageism manifests for people of different genders, gender identities. And I like to talk about it in terms of masculinity and femininity and racial identity. So there's definitely different pressures, different experiences, and different issues for people that identify as masculine and those that identify as feminine. And for men and for masculinity, if you think about the top product that is marketed to older men, it is for low testosterone, it is for erectile dysfunction. And if you think about the shame messaging that goes with that and the messages of what constitutes success being a man or being masculine, it speaks to virility and it speaks to potency. And it really is kind of trying to shape this idea of what is successful. And I think that that is particularly powerful for men. I think very often we don't talk about men or masculinity in terms of being in caregiver roles. And yet research does show that not only are most men caregivers, but many of them really get a lot of joy from that role. They get a lot of purpose and meaning from that role. But we talk less about nurturing and masculinity. We also don't talk as much about retirement and men, and maybe a transition from a messaging of being provider to taking the next stage of life. So I think there's specific issues that are really tied up within this masculinity and ageism intersection. And then with femininity and ageism, I like to think that many women feel hypervisible and invisible all at the same time, and all of the complexities that go along with that. Hypervisibility goes back to that anti-aging campaign and the way that many older people feel as if every wrinkle is on display, that they have to justify either dyeing their hair or not dyeing their hair. The way that older women dress, whatever appropriate for your age may be, there's this hypervisibility of judgment, appearance related, that goes to defining success and successful aging. And then a lot of women will talk about feeling invisible at the same time. Glazes just kind of, washing over, not feeling as if you're heard or valued, feeling passed up maybe for a promotion at work. So this dichotomy of hypervisible and invisible can be really, really powerful. When it comes to racial identity, ageism and intersectionality can really, really bring about cumulative discrimination, inequity, and longevity as well. So the more marginalized and oppressed identities we have, the more likely we are to experience negative outcomes from that. So to be someone with a racial minority identity and getting older, there are very often barriers in the environment, barriers in access to healthcare, barriers in access to healthy foods. There's all kinds of intersections here that can create an inequity. In fact, in my own city of Richmond, Virginia, there was a study done that showed a 20-year discrepancy in life expectancy within a 3-mile radius. So one of the wealthier and white communities in Richmond that is 3 miles from one of the disadvantaged communities that is primarily African-American, there's a 20-year discrepancy in life expectancy. That is cumulative discrimination. That is the intersection of ageism and racism and racial identity. So there's some really powerful, stories and statistics that are in there that again go back to all of the different forms of our identity and how they kind of come together to create our experience. So I feel like at this point, I threw a lot out there at you. I gave you a lot of information about what ageism is and what ableism is and why it matters. And I think now is a time to kind of pause and take a breath and to say, all right, that was a lot. What do I do from here? Because it's great to see it, but then we need to start thinking about the now what. So my first step for you, my first recommendation is to remind yourself why this matters to you. And it can be any number of things we talked about. It could matter because you want those 7.5 years. It can matter because you want to create an equitable society where all people can thrive. It can matter because you actually run a business and you want your employees to be able to stay longer, to be happier, to do good work. All of these are great reasons why. Find your reason why. Find why it matters to you and kind of pin that and keep that in mind. Then we can start to listen. We can start to listen to the way that we think and we talk about aging. We can start to listen and think about the way other people frame and talk about aging, because once you see it, you're going to see it everywhere. Once those blinders come off, then it's like, wow, I had no idea it was all around me. And then we can start to learn. And being here is an excellent start to that. You know, this could be the first conversation or the 100th conversation that you've had about ageism, about why, about how, about what comes next for you. This is certainly a journey. It's not something that you just say, oh, okay, I get ageism now, and now you're there. This is something that we're constantly going to be thinking about and working on and setting goals for ourselves. So remind yourself of why, listen, and then once you're ready, you can start to work on disrupting. And I use this term disrupting really purposefully because disruption is hard. Disruption is uncomfortable and disruption takes some bravery. You know, first we need to see it and then we need to kind of develop all of the skills so that we can figure out how. How do we disrupt it out there? So I'm going to leave you with a couple of those skills. So first thing I want to ask is think about these questions that I asked you not 30 minutes ago. What do you think it means to be old? How do you feel about yourself as an aging person? And how do you talk about growing older? This is where I want you to reflect for a little bit after this webinar, to really think through some of these things and to get to that personal feeling of you and your own aging and how your own aging is continuing to unfold and how your identity intersects with the other forms of your identity to create your aging experience. Maybe after this half hour, you feel a little bit differently about it. Maybe you're curious to think about it some more. This is a great place to start. So disruption definitely starts with self. Then we can start to think about the language. Now, remember, this is not just about what we say. It's about the intent behind it. It's about what we're really internalizing and saying to ourselves. So we can start to reframe some of this language. Instead of using that crisis language or saying the silver tsunami, instead of equating aging with a natural disaster, we can just say more people are growing older, because that's the truth. That's what the demographics show. There are more people that are growing older. There are people that are turning 65 every day, and that number is just going to continue to increase. Instead of saying things like, I feel so old, we can ask ourselves what we mean when we say old. Do we mean old as in I feel tired, I feel exhausted, I feel sick, I don't feel well? Well, then say that. Say what it is that you feel. If we say I feel so old in terms of how quickly time has passed, we can say that, but we can add a little context to it. I will often say I feel so old when I look at my children. My son just graduated college. That makes me feel old, not in a value-based way, but just in how quickly time has passed kind of a way. So really recognize when you're using those terms old and young with judgment and with value. Young spirit is a great example of how we do that with young. When you say young spirit, what you probably mean is engaged or lively or energetic. You don't actually mean young, but we use this term young. It's just kind of a default to say something that's positive. So think about that the next time you're going to say it, and instead just say what you mean. I'm sure you can all imagine that I hate the term senior moment. I'm sure many of you do as well. We all have moments that we forget. It's easy enough just to say, I forgot. And the truth is, as we get older, when we have more lived experience and accumulated knowledge, sometimes it does take us longer to recall a word, and that is perfectly okay. So we don't need to demoralize that. So we're thinking about ourselves, we're thinking about how we talk about it. And then the next part of disruption is thinking about how we respond in the moment. And this is a tricky one, and this takes practice, and this also takes some bravery, and it really depends on the context. So the next time somebody approaches you and says, you haven't aged a bit, how do you respond? The next time someone says, you look younger every time I see you, what do you say back to them? When we see ageism in the moment, how do we attend to it? How do we respond to it? And again, this truly depends. There will be times that I feel really comfortable saying, well, I don't think you mean I look younger. I think you're trying to tell me I look great, and I can reframe. Or there are times where I might say, what do you mean by that? You know, explain what you mean, and try and engage someone in conversations. There are times I don't think it's appropriate to say anything, and I may say something later. It really all depends on where you are and who you're with, if there's a power dynamic within it. But this is a challenge. This is a challenge for you to say, next time I'm in this situation, how do I respond to it? And the more we practice, the easier this gets. And then in terms of disruption, I want to challenge you to reframe the way you think about aging as a whole. When we think about aging, we often think about it in terms of our physicality, and we think about aging as a sole process of decline. Aging is about our bodies, but aging is also about our minds and our social roles and our spiritual self. And all of these things kind of come together to create the whole aging experience. So see the whole story of aging, not one of decline, but one of growth, one of some loss, one of maintenance, one of adaptation. But this is just like any other stage of our life. Aging comes with challenges, and aging comes with rewards. So next time you're talking about how much you dislike aging, let's say because you have an issue with your knee, or you have arthritis, or whatever it may be, recognize that's true, but that's only one part of aging. That is just the physical part of aging. And there's many ways in which you are growing at the same time. So seeing that whole story of aging is a very powerful way to disrupt the way we think and reframe the way we think. We can also work on breaking down this notion of successful aging and creating our own definition of successful aging. Unfortunately, my field has done a little bit of damage here. We have defined successful aging over the years as maintaining health, as maintaining independence, and as maintaining our ability to be active. We don't need to have any of those components to be successful at aging. Someone with a cognitive impairment, someone with a physical disability, these are all people that are aging successfully. We get to define it ourselves. We get to say what is important to us as we grow older. And then we get to say where we can find purpose, meaning, and joy. So we need to break down this concept of successful aging and realize, number one, we can define it ourselves. Number two, it's not just on the individual. Communities come together to be responsible for successful aging. And then finally, I just want to chat about the stages of our life and how this is another form of disrupting our current narrative. We see very often aging as decline, as I said. Part of that is because we talk about stages of life like childhood and adolescence and adulthood. And then very often we just go to retirement. We don't talk about what comes after adulthood. And this is why I think the term elderhood is something that holds real importance. Elderhood to me is a very specific term, not that I use for another label or another way to classify, but because I think we need a strengths-based way to see older age. And I think we need to recognize that we develop in different ways after adulthood. right? Not to say that we're not always adults, we are, but I think in elderhood, whenever it is that we reach that stage, there's no one age, there's no one path, we have different opportunities for contributions, for markers, for milestones, for celebrations. And right now, when you think about it, other than retirement, we don't have a whole lot of ways that we celebrate those. We don't have a lot of ways that we think about what it means to be older and what kind of contributions we can fill in when we're older. Society doesn't really have names for that. And that's why I think this concept of elderhood, which is very growth-based, is really important. In order to look at elderhood, we have to see that we've used retirement currently as our model for older adulthood. Retirement really is not a stage of life. Retirement is a social institution. And in the book, I talk about how we kind of leaned into this retirement living and this retirement language, which became a form of age segregation, which really became leisure without purpose. Vacations are wonderful, but vacations are wonderful because they end. People are driven by the need to contribute and by the need to belong. So to see older people as just retired, I think is a very withdrawal-based way to see older adulthood. Again, why I like to use the word elderhood, because I think that that is much bigger. And I'm going to skip this one because we're running out of time. So I want to leave you with this. We are all the ages that we have ever been. We are the culmination of all of our lived identities and all of ourselves. When you say to yourself, I still feel like that 18-year-old that's in me, you are that 18-year-old that's in you. You're another version of that 18-year-old. We all continue to build our identities, and we build them over time. And to think of this convoy of selves, to think that we are all the ages we have ever been, I think there's a lot of power in that. And then to really think differently about later life. As Carl Jung said, the afternoon of life is just as full of meaning, but its meaning and its purpose are very different. How is elderhood different than adulthood? What are the unique opportunities for contributions and meaning making in elderhood or legacy creation? These are really important conversations that we can start to have with each other. And we're all role models for aging. Everything we say and everything we model for people makes a difference. And we are all role models at all of our ages. So that means that we all have the responsibility to work on this and to model it for others. And it means we all have the power to do so. So I will stop there and see if you all have any questions. And I thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gendron. So we do have a lot of questions in the chat. And while I'm reading those, you, the participants of the session, you can raise your hand and we can actually open the mic up so that you can ask questions. So I'm going to start with the written questions while everyone is thinking of a question and raising their hand. So the first question from Audrey was, how do you convince someone that they still have worth and can contribute in the workforce at a certain age?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You know, one of the things I think that we get stuck in our thinking is when we're talking to older people, I think we often talk about what they did, who they were in their past, instead of talking about who they are now and who they want to become. So I think we can all have these kind of dialogues with older people to really start to talk about, you know, what are your skills and talents? What are the things that you really want to keep doing? What maybe do you want to build on? And actually to take advantage right now of a very unique situation, this great resignation and great retention, in which there's plenty of space for lots of people to come into the workforce and to be driven by something that's really meaningful to them. So I think try and work those conversations and reframe it from who I was, what I did, to who I am and who I want to continue to become.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to the next question. We have a resident of Canada, Mike who says, we started out with the names Seniors Work NL, then we changed it to Older Workers NL. No one wanted to be a senior. And now we have rebranded to Experienced Older, in parens, Older Workers NL. Are we ageist in our naming?
That's a great question. You know, I don't think we're ever going to find the right euphemism until we stop stigmatizing all of them. So it's like, yeah, people don't want to be called seniors. People don't want to be called old. People don't want to be called, it's because we stigmatize it. So I think at some point, what we need to focus on is less maybe the language, but more of just, you know, taking the stigma away. I think experienced is fine. I really do. It's just, you know, I think the intent is that we need to work on the sentiment behind it, the way that we value or devalue. I love the word old, and I think we should take the word old back. And I think we should all be able to say, I am old, and that is okay. But no, I don't think you're inherently ageist. I think you're trying to do the best you can with a very complicated situation. Okay, so Jeff had asked, why is it so hard for people to speak up? Why is it so hard, especially when we're talking about why I might want to stay at work, when I'm in my 60s, 70s, 80s, and the shame and the feeling of discomfort that comes along with that. And I think that part of it is because of how long you have been around these negative messages about what it means to age and be old. You know, we did a video, we created a video on ageism, and we went to kind of see how far back we could find a magazine cover that said, look 20 years younger. And we found something from the 1950s. So that means that older people right now have been swimming in this unchallenged pretty much their entire lives. And you're coming from a culture in the 1950s and the 1960s, which did normalize retirement. And it created this sense of retirement being the epitome of success. Well, what do you do when you get older? You retire and you move to Sun City, or you move to the villages, or this is what you do. You want to live in age segregated communities. And slowly but surely over the past 20 years, I think we've been really starting to challenge some of those notions. But it's hard when something is really deeply embedded within you. So I think, again, the first thing is seeing it, recognizing that you feel the shame around it, recognizing that there is a movement underway to change the way we feel about this. There are many of us that are out there right now who are writing about this, speaking about this, trying to talk to HR people about this, to say that we need to change the culture. And maybe to take advantage of the current circumstances where there is a shortage of workers and it is an opportunity for older people to kind of plug in places that they may want to speak up and to feel as if they have more of a voice. I know it's hard, but I feel like we are moving more and more towards critical mass. And that does take each one of us.
Here's a question from Nancy. I never would guess you were that old all the time. I'm 62, never know how to respond to reframe their sense of me and reflect my identity. Ideas?
Yes. And I'm going to take this one from Ashton Applewhite, who is another great advocate on ageism and has also written a book on it. I love what she says when someone says, you know, you look great for your age. And she'll say, well, you look great for your age too. So, you know, I wonder if maybe that's a retort for you of, well, you don't look however old you are, or to say, well, I'm not sure what it's supposed to look like, but this is me at this age. So I think there are ways that we can kind of say some clever things within the moment just to give people a little bit of a wake up and say, well, what does that even mean? And then also just to own your age and to say, yeah, this is me, this is 62, and this is what it looks like. So I love borrowing that one from Ashton, because I think that it can just, you know, be a good one in the moment.
Okay, and here's a comment / question from Imelda. Aging gracefully, ? We only say that about aging, which is lifelong, when we are talking about later life. It doesn't feel comfortable to me.
Agreed. Yeah, aging, living is not all graceful. It's really messy, right? Every stage has challenges, every stage has opportunities. And most of the growth we have comes at really, really messy and uncomfortable times. So I think aging is all of it. I'm also just not a huge fan of the gracefully. I want to age ungracefully. I want to age in my own way with all its messiness.
Yeah, well, I had a question that was in the middle of everyone else's, so I'm going to say, so when I was 40, I thought, I'm not young. And then people were telling me that when you're 60, you're young old, and then there's another age where you're old old.
That's another thing
And
gerontologists did.
mhm.
Yes, we created this young, oldest old. And again, the problem with that is like our functional age and our chronological age often don't match, right? So again, what does that mean? If we're talking about, you know, how frail we might be, that could have nothing to do with age. You could have someone who is 40 who is very frail and someone who's 85 who is not. So I don't love those either, but yeah, we're all however old we are. Again, it comes back to just embracing that.
Okay, and then one last comment that'll read is from Xiaomara. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I am a 58-year-old, and it is hard for me to find a place in my community to eat out or socialize with people my age.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a question. Solutions, maybe.
Yes, and I
yeah.
know there are, I don't know where you are, but there are definitely some more online resources around that. There's a great resource I would start with, oldschool.info, and they have anti-ageism resources, but they may even have some connections for local communities.
All right. Well, we're coming up on the hour, so thank you so much for spending this hour with us, Tracey Gendron, and thank you, Laurie, and thank you everyone for coming.